Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 22nd of July 2022 of the New Delhi edition. The first article for today's analysis appears on page number 12. The article is titled as Karnataka tops the Niti Aayog Innovation Index list. This article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the publication of India Innovation Index by Niti Aayog. Hence, this article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Indian Economy. So, as far as the prelims examination is concerned, one should be aware about various details about the India Innovation Index and various global indices which are published in order to measure the extent of innovation across the different countries. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about various aspects of the innovation ecosystem in India. That is, need, achievements, problems and strategies to boost the innovation ecosystem. Hence, based upon the discussion of this particular topic, you should be in a position to write an answer to this particular mains question for practice. The question here is, despite significant achievements, R&D ecosystem in India continues to remain underdeveloped. In this regard, examine the concerns in the innovation ecosystem and also suggest certain measures. Apart from this particular mains question for practice, you should also be in a position to attempt these 4 prelims based questions for practice. So what we will do here is, first and foremost, we will understand various aspects related to the innovation ecosystem in India. And once we are done with this, we will look into the different aspects related to the India Innovation Index. So let's start our discussion with respect to innovation in India, particularly with respect to why should a developing country such as India need to focus upon research and development. See, if you look at most of the developed countries across the world, these developed countries have spent substantial amount of money on research and development to promote growth in their economies. So if you look at countries such as US, Japan, etc., these are the countries which have significantly invested in research and development to promote growth and development. Similarly, it is being said that if it has to become a $5 trillion economy, if India has to ensure Atmanirbhar Bharat, then accordingly we have to significantly ramp up investment in the research and development. So here, investment in research and development would have multifaceted benefits for the Indian economy. First and foremost, investment in research and development would enhance the input efficiency of the Indian economy. So here, if you are able to spend on research and development, we would be able to develop advanced technologies. So by developing advanced technologies, we would be able to use various inputs such as land, labor, capital, etc. more efficiently. So in a way, by investing in research and development, we would be able to increase the overall productivity of the Indian economy. So overall, the inputs in the Indian economy can be efficiently utilized, leading to a high GDP growth rate. Investment in new age technologies would also enhance the labor productivity in a country such as India. The Indian agriculture is facing the problem of disguised unemployment. So even though the Indian agriculture contributes almost around 20% to India's GDP, it continues to employ 45% of India's workforce. So one way to enhance the labor productivity is through adoption of the mechanization in the Indian agriculture. So mechanization is one aspect of innovation in the Indian agriculture. So by adopting agricultural mechanization, we would be able to reduce this particular problem of disguised unemployment. So the workers who are presently employed in the Indian agriculture can move to more productive activities such as manufacturing, services, etc., leading to a high labor productivity as well as higher ability to reap the present demographic dividend within India. Third and most important aspect is with respect to the fact that it unleashes creative destruction. So what exactly is creative destruction? Let's understand this. Now let's say you have an old and inefficient manufacturing firm. Now this old and inefficient manufacturing firm would be using various factors of production such as land, labor, capital, etc. But here the problem is, since it is quite old, since it is quite inefficient, it has not been able to utilize these factors of production, that is land, labor and capital, efficiently. So if industries are able to spend on research and development, if you are able to come up with new technologies, automatically the industries would become more efficient. So once we have new efficient industries coming into the Indian economy, these old and inefficient firms will not be in a position to compete with the new age efficient firms. Moreover, these efficient firms will be able to provide for various goods and services at much lower prices. They would be able to provide goods and services which are of international standards or of good quality. So automatically the old and inefficient firms will not be able to withstand the competition, and accordingly it will lead to replacement of the old and inefficient firms by the more efficient firms. Now in a way this is actually good. Why is it good? This is so because once these old and inefficient firms get destructed, whatever factors of production these old and inefficient firms are using, these factors of production will be now utilized by more efficient firms. That is why it is referred to as creative destruction. So even though we are destructing old and inefficient firms, it is actually creative. It is more efficient. So this is possible through investment in research and development. Nextly, most of the countries across the world, including China, they are focusing on the new age technologies such as artificial intelligence, big data, robotics, machine learning, and so on, in order to give a thrust to the Industrial Revolution 4.0. So India cannot afford to miss this particular bus. India needs to latch on or capitalize on the opportunities of the Industrial Revolution 4.0, and that is possible through the research and development. And nextly, it will foster the spirit of scientific inquiry as enshrined as one of the fundamental duties in the Indian Constitution. And more importantly, we can move from being a net consumer of knowledge to a net producer of knowledge. So India has made significant strides as far as the research and development is concerned. For example, if you want to measure the overall investment of a country in terms of research and development, we have a parameter of GERD, which stands for Gross Expenditure on Research and Development. This gross expenditure on research and development can be measured either in terms of absolute values or in terms of percentage of GDP. Now, as far as India is concerned, in terms of absolute value of gross expenditure on research and development, it has tripled in the last one decade. So it has increased from rupees 40,000 crores to 1.2 lakh crores. So we have significantly increased our investment in research and development, at least in terms of absolute value. Similarly, India presently stands third in terms of publication of scientific journals across the world. Third highest number of PhDs are awarded in India when you compare with other countries. And in terms of the number of patent applications filed across the world, India is placed at 7th position. Now, all of these achievements were highlighted by the Economic Survey 2020. In spite of these achievements, even today, India faces a number of constraints and challenges with respect to the innovation ecosystem. What are these constraints and challenges? First and foremost is with respect to lower share of gross expenditure on research and development as percentage of GDP. So here we have a graph which shows India's expenditure on research and development both in terms of absolute value as well as in terms of percentage of GDP. As you can see here, in terms of absolute value, the investment in research and development has tripled from almost around 40,000 crores in the year 2005-6 to almost around 1.2 lakh crore in the year 2018-19. But the problem here is with respect to investment in research and development as percentage of GDP. So as you can see, in the year 2010-11, the overall investment in research and development was around 0.75% of GDP. And in the year 2018-19, it has actually dropped down to 0.70%. So even though the investment in research and development in terms of absolute value has tripled, but in terms of percentage of GDP, it has remained stagnant in the last 5 years, and in the last 1 decade, it has actually declined from 0.75 to 0.70. So that's the biggest constraint as far as R&D ecosystem in India is concerned. Secondly, if you compare India's expenditure on research and development as percentage of GDP and compare that with other countries, it is extremely lower. So for India, it is 0.7%. For China, it is 2.1%. For US, it is 2.8%. Israel is much higher at almost around 4.6 to 4.7%. The next problem is with respect to share of private sector investment in research and development. Now, if you look at countries such as US, Japan, Israel, Korea, etc., in these countries, a substantial chunk of investment in research and development is basically coming from the business sector, that is the private sector. But unfortunately, in case of India, it is actually the opposite. So as you can see very clearly here, a major chunk of investment is actually done by the government of India and the state government, and very less amount of investment is done by the private sector. Thirdly, see, whatever money that we are spending on research and development, it is majorly spent on certain important sectors which include defense, space, and atomic energy. So since we are spending more on these 3 to 4 sectors, very less amount of money is spent on the social sectors such as health. So that's a third important problem. The next problem is with respect to less number of patents being filed by the Indian residents. See, in terms of the number of patents filed, India is presently ranked at 7th position at the global level. But the problem here is a major chunk of patents filed in India are actually filed by the non-residents. So the share of the overall Indian residents in the patent applications is quite lower. For example, almost around 64% of the patents in India, they are filed by non-residents, whereas the share of residents is quite lower at 36%. In comparison, just have a look at the China. Almost 89% of the patents are filed by the Chinese residents, and just around 11% of the patents are filed by the non-residents. The next problem is with respect to the role of Indian universities. Now, if you look at universities, particularly in countries such as US, Japan, etc., the universities in these countries have not only focused on imparting learning, but these universities have also focused upon investment in research and development. Whereas the universities in case of India, they have not given adequate amount of focus on research and development, and they have given more amount of focus on learning only. The next problem is with respect to quality of scientific journals. Yes, in terms of the quantity, that is in terms of the number of scientific journals published, India is ranked at 3rd place. But the problem is with respect to the poor quality of scientific journals. So if you want to know the quality of scientific journals, you would have to look at how many times the Indian journals have been cited in the journals published in other countries. So in terms of number of citations, very few scientific journals published in India are actually cited in the other scientific journals, which goes on to show the poor quality of scientific journals. So what strategies should we adopt in order to boost the innovation ecosystem in India? See, first and foremost, as India is significantly underspending on research and development, the overall investment in research and development should increase to at least around 2% of India's GDP. Secondly, even though India has made rapid strides with respect to the gross enrollment ratio of the students in the primary and secondary education, the learning outcomes of the students continues to remain poor. This is evident in the fact that the children who are educated, these children do not have adequate maths and cognitive skills. So we must understand that the children of today, they are going to be the youths of future. So if we have to boost the innovation ecosystem, we would have to improve the quality of education that we are imparting to the children. Already, in order to improve the innovation ecosystem at the school level, the government of India is implementing the Atal Innovation Mission. So under the Atal Innovation Mission, we are setting up the Atal Tinkering Labs at the school level. So more such labs should have to be opened in order to boost the innovation at the school level. Apart from that, presently a large number of non-resident Indians, they are actually pursuing their research in other countries. So we must try to attract these NRIs back to India in order to carry out research within India. Already, the Ministry of Science and Technology is implementing a scheme known as Vajra scheme. Under this particular Vajra scheme, the government is providing necessary incentives to the NRIs to come back to India and carry out their research and development. So this particular scheme has to be efficiently utilized. We must give more of funding and necessary support to the researchers. And nextly, if you look at Global Innovation Index, which is actually published by WIPO, that is World Intellectual Property Organization. So according to this WIPO, necessary framework should have to be laid down for boosting the innovation ecosystem. And that framework is in terms of institutional framework and the business sophistication. So in terms of institutional framework, we would have to improve the quality of regulation. We have to improve the ease of doing business. And in terms of business sophistication, necessary training would have to be provided to the employees so that they can involve in research and development. The industries should collaborate with the universities to undertake research and development. And Indian companies should be encouraged to enter into joint ventures or strategic alliances with the foreign companies in order to focus upon research and development. So these are some of the strategies. So having discussed all the aspects related to the innovation ecosystem in India, let us now look into some important aspects of the India Innovation Index. The India Innovation Index, it is actually prepared by Niti Aayog and Institute for Competitiveness. The first edition of India Innovation Index was published in the year 2019, and now Niti Aayog has published its third edition of India Innovation Index. This particular index seeks to rank the states and union territories based upon their innovation ecosystem. It also seeks to recognize various opportunities and challenges with respect to the innovation. And lastly, based upon the challenges which it identifies, this index also recommends as to what policies should be adopted to boost the innovation. Now, with respect to its importance, see, right now, the government is implementing a particular initiative known as Global Indices for Reforms and Growth Initiative. Now, this is an initiative under the Cabinet Secretary, and under this particular initiative, we are actually tracking India's performance on various global indices, such as Global Hunger Index, Human Development Index, Human Capital Index, and so on. So we are trying to ensure that India's performance on each of these global indices improves over a period of time. And as far as the Global Innovation Index is concerned, India wants to break into the top 25 ranks. So already India has made significant achievements as far as the Global Innovation Index is concerned. India has consistently improved its performance on the Global Innovation Index, and presently it is ranked among the top 50 countries. So going forward, we have set a target that India's place should be within top 25. To calculate this India Innovation Index, the Niti Aayog is using 7 pillars. Out of these 7 pillars, 5 pillars are used to measure the enabling ecosystem for boosting innovation, which is to measure the input side of innovation. And two pillars are with respect to the performance, that is the outputs of innovation. So with respect to these pillars, you can just have a look. The enablers are human capital, investment, knowledge workers, business environment, safety and legal environment. So these are actually the inputs for the innovation. With respect to performance, that is the outputs. Here you have two pillars, that is knowledge output and knowledge diffusion. Now with respect to human capital, here we are taking into account number of aspects such as the number of schools with ICT labs, the enrollment in engineering and technology colleges, enrollment in the PhDs, and so on. Similarly, in terms of knowledge output, we are looking at how many patents are filed from a particular state, how many startups are based in a particular state. So these are some of the parameters. But as far as the UPSC examination is concerned, there is no need for you to get into all of these details. So if you just know basics about India Innovation Index, that alone should be sufficient. Now coming to latest rankings, in order to rank the different states and union territories, the Niti Aayog has categorized the states and union territories into three different categories, which include the major states, northeast and hilly states, union territory and city states. And as you can see, among the major states, you have Karnataka, Telangana and Haryana, which are the top ranked states. Among the northeastern and hilly states, the top two ranked states are Manipur and Uttarakhand. And among the union territories, the top ranked union territories are Chandigarh and Delhi. So this is all you must understand as far as the innovation ecosystem in India is concerned. So based upon our discussion, please have a look at these 4 prelims questions for practice. Please solve these questions and let me know the answer in the comment section given below. The next article appears on page number 8 as a lead article. The article is titled as "In the Pegasus Battle, the Fight for the Surveillance Reform." This article shall be important from the perspective of both GS Paper 2 Polity and Governance as well as GS Paper 3 Internal Security. This article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the controversy over the Pegasus spyware. Hence, as far as the UPSC examination is concerned, one should be aware about various aspects of the surveillance laws in India. That is, what is the present legal framework for carrying out surveillance? What kind of safeguards have been built in these legal framework so as to prevent its misuse by the government? What are the problems in the surveillance laws? And what should be the way ahead? So based upon our discussion of all of these aspects, a mains rated question for your practice here could be: the surveillance framework in India needs to achieve an optimum balance between the right to privacy of individuals and national interest. In the light of this statement, discuss various concerns raised with respect to India's surveillance framework. So what we will do here is, first we'll understand the background to this particular story, then we'll discuss about the Pegasus spyware, and then we'll get into the debate about the India's surveillance framework. So as far as the background to this particular story is concerned, the background to this story can be traced to last year, that is July 2021. In July 2021, a number of newspapers in India reported that the government had illegally used the Pegasus spyware to carry out the illegal surveillance of more than 100 high-profile personalities, which included judges, cabinet ministers, opposition leaders, journalists, and so on. Subsequent to this, the international NGO Amnesty International carried out a forensic analysis, and it confirmed that such an illegal surveillance had indeed taken place. This was further confirmed by WhatsApp, which highlighted that even its servers were affected by an spyware. Subsequently, an article appeared in New York Times which clearly highlighted that the Indian government had bought this Pegasus spyware from the Israeli government. So if you look at this Pegasus spyware, it is actually sold only to the government agencies. So since it is sold only to the government agencies, the opposition parties as such highlighted that the government may have used this Pegasus spyware in order to spy on certain high profile personalities in India. Subsequently, the government of India came under immense pressure as well as criticism. However, a large number of government ministers in their statement highlighted that the present legal framework as such prevents unauthorized surveillance. So, in a way, the government did not deny that the surveillance did not take place. The government highlighted that whatever surveillance is presently taking place in India, it is carried out in accordance with a legal framework and hence it is legal. So government in a way ruled out any kind of illegal surveillance taking place in India. The government agency, that is the Computer Emergency Response Team, which is a nodal agency to deal with all the cyber attacks, this agency has so far remained silent on this particular issue. Further, no debate or discussion could take place in the parliament because of frequent disruptions over this particular controversy. Subsequently, in August 2021, a bunch of petitioners approached the Supreme Court and asked the Supreme Court to look into this particular issue. Now, this particular case is now referred to as Manohar Lal Sharma versus Union of India case. In this particular case, the Supreme Court has now set up a technical committee to look into this particular issue. So far, this technical committee has not submitted its recommendations to the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court is still awaiting the final recommendations of this technical committee. And now this particular case is likely to come up before the Supreme Court by the end of July 2022. So as you can clearly see here, we have almost completed 1 year of this Pegasus controversy, and so far we have not been able to reach a conclusion to this particular issue. And that is why this particular article has appeared in today's newspaper. Now coming to various details about the Pegasus spyware. Now Pegasus is a spyware which is developed and licensed by an Israeli company known as the NSO Group. This particular spyware can be used to infiltrate smartphones that run on both Android as well as iOS operating system. So by infiltrating these mobile phones could be turned into the surveillance devices. The method of attack used by the Pegasus spyware is also referred to as the zero-click attack. See, in case of the normal spyware, what happens is the hackers normally send you a link, and if you click on such a link, then the spyware would get installed on the phone. But in case of the Pegasus spyware, the hackers need not send you a link. The hackers would simply give you a missed call on the WhatsApp, and as soon as you receive a missed call on the WhatsApp, the Pegasus spyware would get installed on your phone. So here the Pegasus spyware gets installed on the phone without the phone owner knowing about it. And once this particular spyware enters the device, it installs a module to track the call logs. It will be able to read the messages. It will be able to read the emails, your calendar, internet history, and even the location data. As you can see, it can even turn on the camera, record a video, take photos, and then record the screen. And whatever things are captured, those things will be sent back to the hacker. See, government of any country needs to be sufficiently armed in order to fight the modern day crimes such as fake news, terrorism, money laundering, etc. Various antisocial elements as well as terrorists, they have become more techno savvy, and they are using modern day technology in order to create social unrest. For example, antisocial elements use social media platforms such as WhatsApp in order to create unnecessary rumors. They also use the social media platforms to organize themselves and indulge in large scale violence. Hence, in order to fight the modern day crimes, government of any country also needs to use the modern day technology to carry out the surveillance. So surveillance as such has become a necessity for the government to fight the modern day crimes. However, if you look at the surveillance as such has emerged as a double-edged sword. Now, why do I call it as a double-edged sword? Because on one hand, it has become a necessity because the government needs to carry out surveillance in order to ensure peace and stability. While on the other hand, if this surveillance is misused, this can trample upon the fundamental rights of the people, that is, the right to privacy of the individuals. So that is why it is being said that even if the government carries out surveillance, it should try to find a right balance between the need to protect the national interest and the need to protect the privacy of the individuals. So, keeping in mind this particular aspect, let us look into the present legal framework for carrying out surveillance. See, right now we have two laws in India which empower the government to carry out the surveillance. One is the Indian Telegraph Act 1885. Under this particular act, both the center as well as state, they are empowered to carry out the surveillance of the telegraph. That is, they can tap the phones of certain individuals. So through the phone tapping, they can tap the calls, messages, etc. Apart from this, we also have the Information Technology Act 2003. Now, the scope of this IT Act is much more broader in comparison to the Indian Telegraph Act 1885. While the Indian Telegraph Act 1885 basically deals with the tapping of phones, the IT Act deals with the electronic surveillance, that is basically any kind of information that is transmitted through computers. So the IT Act 2003 provides for monitoring, interception and decryption of information which is transmitted through the use of computers. So just like how the fundamental rights in case of India are not absolute, similarly here the right of the government to tap the phone calls or to carry out electronic surveillance is also not absolute. The government can carry out the surveillance on certain grounds. Now we have certain grounds which are common to both Indian Telegraph Act 1885 and IT Act 2003. And these grounds are sovereignty and integrity of India, defense of India, security of India, friendly relations with other countries, public order, incitement to offences, etc. So these grounds are common to both these two acts. So on the basis of these grounds, government, that is both center and state, can carry out the surveillance. Apart from these common grounds, we also have certain specific grounds as well. For example, under the Indian Telegraph Act 1885, apart from all of these common grounds, the government can also carry out the phone tapping in case of occurrence of a public emergency. Similarly, under the IT Act 2003, the center and state can also carry out the electronic surveillance as part of the investigation process. Further, in order to ensure that the government does not misuse its powers of surveillance, necessary safeguards have been built based upon the Supreme Court judgment in a very famous case known as People's Union for Civil Liberties versus Union of India case 2007. In this particular case, the Supreme Court highlighted that even though we have a legal framework for carrying out surveillance, we do not have adequate rules and procedures for carrying out surveillance. So if you don't have necessary rules, necessary procedures for carrying out surveillance, then automatically it can lead to creation of a surveillance state. It can lead to violation of people's right to privacy. Accordingly, the Supreme Court laid down necessary rules and procedures. So these rules as such have now become part of Rule 419A of Indian Telegraph Rules. So under these rules, if we have to carry out the surveillance, necessary approval would have to be given by the Home Secretary either at the center or at the state level. Further, the rules also provide that under certain unavoidable circumstances, the approval may also be given by an officer not below the rank of additional secretary, so empowered by the Home Secretary. So Home Secretary as such can delegate his powers to any officer who is not below the rank of additional secretary, and such an officer can also give approval under certain unavoidable circumstances. But the problem here is as to what exactly is unavoidable circumstances, that has not been clearly mentioned in the rules. Further, it has also been highlighted that in emergency situations, even the head of the law enforcement agency, that is police, can also give for an approval. So as you can see, we have multiple authorities who can give approval for the surveillance, starting with the Home Secretary. Second, the officer who is not below the rank of additional secretary, and even the head of the law enforcement agency. The rules also provide that whenever the government is carrying out surveillance, the reasons for carrying out surveillance on a particular individual should clearly be mentioned in writing. Before carrying out surveillance of any individual, the government should explore the possibility of acquiring information through other means. So, if acquiring information through other means is not possible, only then the government should go for the surveillance. And lastly, in order to ensure that the rules are correctly implemented, we have set up a review committee at both center and the state level. At the center, the review committee is headed by the cabinet secretary, and at the state level, the review committee is headed by the respective chief secretary at the state level. Now, coming to various concerns with respect to the surveillance framework, first and foremost, the recent Pegasus controversy has clearly highlighted that the mass surveillance would clearly violate the fundamental right to privacy of the individuals as enshrined in the Puttaswamy judgment. So that's the first thing. The second problem is with respect to the approval for surveillance. So as I've highlighted before, presently we have multiple authorities who can give approval for the surveillance. And there are no clear-cut guidelines as to which authority has to give approval under what circumstances. For example, an officer not below the rank of additional secretary can give approval under unavoidable circumstances. But what are these unavoidable circumstances? That has not been clearly mentioned. Similarly, in case of emergency situations, even the head of the law enforcement agency, that is police, can also give approval. But once again, as to what do you mean by emergency situation, clearly not well defined. So here we have multiple authorities who can give approvals, and these authorities as such, they are providing approvals without any kind of legislative or any kind of judicial oversight. So because of such kind of discretionary powers vested in the hands of authorities, the powers as such could be misused. The third problem is with respect to the grounds for surveillance. So here the government, that is both center and state, can carry out surveillance on grounds such as sovereignty and integrity, defense, security of India, and so on. So according to some experts, they do believe that these grounds for carrying out surveillance are actually vague, ambiguous, and prone to misuse. So accordingly, it could lead to executive overreach and violate the right to privacy. And if carried out on large scale, this can lead to creation of a mass surveillance state, which clearly goes against the democratic ideals of any country. The next one is with respect to the authority for carrying out surveillance. See, once the approval for surveillance is given, multiple authorities can actually carry out the surveillance. So surveillance may be carried out by the police department, it can be carried out by the CBI department, it can be carried out by the enforcement directorate, and so on. So we have multiple authorities who can carry out the actual surveillance. The problem here is some of these authorities as such, they lack necessary independence and autonomy. So some of these authorities such as CBI, ED, etc., they are directly controlled by the government. They do not have necessary independence and autonomy. And that is why, once again, it is prone to misuse. Moreover, we must also understand that when these authorities carry out the surveillance, there is no parliamentary oversight of these authorities. So these authorities as such, they are not answerable to the parliament, and that is where it creates the problem. The last problem is with respect to scope of surveillance. So when we are actually carrying out surveillance of a particular person, either through phone tapping or the electronic surveillance, right now we do not have clearly defined rules as to what kind of data should be collected. That is, should we collect only that particular data which is related to crimes, or should we even collect even the private data of the individual or not? Ideally, even when we are carrying out phone tapping or electronic surveillance, we should not be collecting the private data. We must collect only that particular data that is related to his crimes. But as of now, we do not have any clearly defined rules on what kind of data should be collected. And once this particular data is collected, how to prevent the misuse of such a data. That is why when the famous Neera Radia phone tapping case took place in the year 2013, apart from the phone tapping which was related to the case, even the personal conversations were also retained. So in order to address these concerns and challenges with respect to surveillance framework, there is a need to come up with a new surveillance law which is able to clearly balance between the need to protect the national interest and the need to promote the right to privacy of the individuals. So how should we come up with such a surveillance law? Now this particular surveillance law should be based upon the principles as enunciated by the Supreme Court in the famous Puttaswamy judgment. So in the famous Puttaswamy judgment, the Supreme Court ruled that right to privacy is a fundamental right of the individuals. But at the same time, this particular right to privacy is not an absolute right. The government can infringe upon the right to privacy of the individual based upon three important criteria, that is legality, necessity and proportionality. So on similar lines, the new surveillance law should take into account these three criteria of legality, necessity and proportionality. So with respect to legality, so here we need to have a new law to deal with the surveillance. So that's the first thing. Second, the government should carry out surveillance only when it is extremely necessary. So it should not be involved in mass surveillance. So surveillance must be carried out only in the larger interest of the nation. And last and most important is the criteria of proportionality, which means the means should justify the ends. Before carrying out surveillance, the government should explore all other means for obtaining information from an individual. So when all other options are used and exhausted, only then the government should carry out the surveillance of the individuals. Nextly, we must have to come up with clear, unambiguous grounds for carrying out surveillance. The exercise of powers of surveillance by the executive, it should be reasonable, fair, proportional and judicious. The agencies involved in carrying out surveillance, they must be accountable to the parliament. And last and most importantly, the parliament should pass the personal data protection bill at the earliest in order to protect the data which is actually collected by the agencies. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know as far as the surveillance framework is concerned. The next article appears on page number 8. The article is titled as Advantage New Delhi in Sri Lanka's India's Lifeline. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS paper 2 international relations. As far as this particular article is concerned, one should be aware about India's response to Sri Lankan economic crisis and what opportunities it has for India. So based upon our discussion, a main question for the practice here could be, the recent economic crisis in Sri Lanka presents an opportunity for India to deepen its neighborhood first policy. Elaborate. So what we will do here is, first and foremost, we'll understand the Sri Lanka's economic situation, that is why has Sri Lanka got into a kind of economic crisis, and then we'll discuss as to what has been India's response and what can be the opportunities for India. So I hope all of you must be knowing that presently Sri Lankan economy is in turmoil. So if you look at the present economic situation of Sri Lanka as of April 2022, Sri Lanka had forex reserves of just around $2.3 billion. And this much amount of forex reserves in Sri Lanka is enough to meet the imports for just 1 month. The total amount of external loans which Sri Lanka is required to repay this year is at around $4.3 billion. So as you can see, the external debt which it is required to repay this year, that is $4.3 billion, it is much higher than its forex reserves of $2.3 billion. The overall debt to GDP ratio in case of Sri Lanka has increased to an all-time high of 119%. And most of these loans are dominated by external loans. Further, Sri Lanka is facing acute shortage of essential items such as food, fuel and medicines, which in turn has led to both large-scale protests and political crisis in Sri Lanka. The rate of inflation has also increased to an all-time high. So why did Sri Lanka get into this particular crisis in the first place? There are multiple reasons. Let us look into these reasons one by one, starting with the flawed external sector structure. So if you look at the overall imports into Sri Lanka, these imports are much higher than its exports. So normally Sri Lanka faces the current account deficit, and normally it has less amount of forex reserves. It normally pays for the imports of essential goods and services such as the crude oil, etc., through the revenue which it earns to the tourism sector. So in case of Sri Lanka, the tourism sector alone accounts for 10% of its GDP. So what happened was, consequent to the Easter bombing attacks as well as COVID-19 pandemic, the tourism sector in case of Sri Lanka started declining, which means now the amount of forex reserves with Sri Lanka started reducing, and this in turn reduced its ability to pay for the imports. At the same time, because of COVID-19 pandemic, there was decline in exports of tea, rubber, spices and garments to other countries. So apart from the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war was another major factor which affected the Sri Lankan economy. The tourists from both Russia and Ukraine account for almost around 25% tourists into Sri Lanka. So on account of the Russia-Ukraine war, the inflow of tourists reduced. So already the tourism sector was affected because of COVID-19, and on top of that, the Russia-Ukraine war further affected the tourism sector. This was followed with increase in global crude oil prices and decrease in the export of Sri Lankan tea, particularly to Russia and Ukraine. Further, as you know, China has invested very heavily in the infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, such as Hambantota Port, the East Container Terminal Port at Colombo, and so on. And most of these infrastructure projects, which are funded by China, this has in turn led to a higher external debt for Sri Lanka. And in a way, Sri Lanka has got itself into the debt trap of China. Further, prior to this, in the year 2016, Sri Lanka had borrowed almost around $1.5 billion from IMF. Subsequent to which IMF had imposed a conditionality on the Sri Lankan economy to keep its fiscal deficit under control. So as you can see, the Sri Lankan economy was already affected because of this particular slowdown. So to come out of this slowdown, the Sri Lankan government had to adopt the counter-cyclical fiscal policy, which in turn needed the Sri Lankan government to increase its fiscal deficit. But IMF had imposed condition on Sri Lanka that the fiscal deficit should be under control, because of which the government's ability to pump in more amount of money to counter the economic slowdown was reduced. The next one is with respect to flawed fiscal policy. See, in the year 2019, when the new Sri Lankan government took over, it actually reduced the tax rates and announced more amount of subsidies due to the vote bank politics. Last and most important is the adoption of organic farming. See, annually, Sri Lanka used to spend almost around 0.3% of its GDP on the import of chemical fertilizers. Hence, in order to reduce the import of chemical fertilizers and to save the forex reserves, the Sri Lankan economy decided to adopt the organic farming. But the problem here was Sri Lanka decided to become 100% organic nation overnight. So this in turn literally pushed Sri Lanka to the brink of disaster, as it led to a large scale decrease in the food production, leading to a double digit inflation rate. Now coming to the Chinese aid and challenges as far as the Sri Lankan economic crisis is concerned. Like I said earlier, China has made heavy investment in the infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka, such as the Hambantota Port, the East Container Terminal at Colombo Port, and so on. So these Chinese investment in infrastructure projects has in turn led to the debt trap for the Sri Lankan economy. According to some of the media reports, more than 10% of the external debt owed by Sri Lanka is towards China. And as far as the Chinese response to this Sri Lankan crisis is concerned, the author of this particular article highlights that China is facing a classical dilemma with respect to bailing out Sri Lanka. Now, what is this dilemma? Let's understand that. So, on one hand, we must understand that to a certain extent, Sri Lanka is in a crisis because of the Chinese debt trap. So, obviously, it would put an obligation on China to bail out Sri Lanka. But the problem here is, if the Chinese government goes ahead and bails out Sri Lanka by restructuring its debt, then even the other countries would also demand the same. So, as you must be knowing, that it is not just Sri Lanka which is facing the Chinese debt trap. Even the other smaller economies are also facing the debt trap. So, in future, if these smaller economies face a situation similar to Sri Lanka, then these smaller economies will also demand for restructuring of their debt. So here China is facing a kind of dilemma. That is why China has not been so forthcoming as India in extending aid and help to Sri Lanka. And that is where there is an opportunity for India. So that is why India has capitalized on this particular opportunity. India has so far given bilateral aid worth $2.8 billion to Sri Lanka. This is given through loans, currency swaps, as well as grants. For example, India has extended assistance of $2.5 billion, which includes a credit facility for import of fuel and food. India has also signed a diesel shipment agreement under a 500 million credit line to provide diesel to Sri Lanka. The Reserve Bank of India has also extended a currency swap of $400 million, and it has also deferred payments from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So going forward, this article highlights that there are huge opportunities for India to strengthen its neighborhood first policy. Let's understand how. First and foremost, India can actually work with friendly countries such as US, Japan and European Union. And by working with these friendly countries, we can extend more amount of bilateral aid to Sri Lanka so that the Sri Lankan economy is able to come out of the crisis as early as possible. Secondly, see, under the G20, we have come up with a common framework for the debt restructuring for low income countries. So as part of this common framework for the low income countries, if certain low income countries has taken huge amount of external loans, and if such a country is unable to repay the external loans, then as part of this G20 common framework, we are undertaking the restructuring of the loans which are pending from such low income countries. So this particular framework as such is applicable only to those countries which have been classified as low income countries by the World Bank. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, Sri Lanka as of now, it has been categorized as a middle income country. So since it is categorized as a middle income country, Sri Lanka cannot undertake debt restructuring under the G20 common framework. That is why India is closely working with the international organizations such as IMF, World Bank, etc. to classify Sri Lanka as a low income country at least for a temporary period of time. So if you are able to classify Sri Lanka as a low income country for a temporary period of time, then Sri Lanka would be able to avail the benefit under the G20 common framework. So by working with the other countries and by working with international organizations such as IMF and World Bank, India can provide the necessary aid and assistance to Sri Lanka so that it is able to come out of the economic crisis. And by doing that, India will receive a major fillip to its neighborhood first policy. So this will strengthen India's image as an important responder to any crisis in the South Asian region. Nextly, India is negatively perceived as a big brother among the Sri Lankan people. Sri Lankan people believe that India unnecessarily interferes in their internal affairs. So by extending the bilateral aid and assistance, India can counter its big brother image in Sri Lanka and create a positive image in the minds of the Sri Lankan people. And last and most importantly, right now India and Sri Lanka already have a free trade agreement in place. And since quite a long time, both India and Sri Lanka are trying to finalize the ETCA agreement, that is Economic, Technological and Cooperation Agreement. So this ETCA agreement is much more broader in scope in comparison to the earlier free trade agreement. So what would happen is, once the Sri Lankan economy stabilizes, India can restart its negotiations on ETCA with Sri Lanka. This will in turn help India to deepen its trade and investment linkages in the South Asian region, leading to a much greater regional integration as well as prosperity. So these are some of the important aspects which have been highlighted in this particular article. The next article appears on page number 14. The article is titled as "With the opposition absent, Lok Sabha defers a debate on the Antarctic bill." This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of both Indian polity as well as environment and biodiversity. See, as far as this article is concerned, one should be aware about two important aspects, that is, the details about the Antarctic Treaty and the details about the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022, which the government had introduced in Lok Sabha in April 2022. See, as far as these two aspects are concerned, I have already covered these two aspects in the DNS dated 2nd of April 2022 when the bill was initially introduced in Lok Sabha. As you can see, in this particular DNS, I have discussed the salient features of the Antarctic Treaty. I have also discussed the salient features of the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022. So since this particular topic has already been discussed, I shall not be discussing this topic once again. Rather, I will take up certain prelims questions for practice and then we'll discuss the answers to those questions. Those students who have not seen this particular DNS, I would suggest you to go through the DNS dated 2nd of April 2022 before attempting the practice MCQs. So let us have a look at these two practice MCQs. So MCQ number 5 here is, consider the following statements related to the Antarctic Treaty seen in news recently. The first statement is, the Antarctic Treaty provides for the definition of Antarctica in terms of its geographical location. Now, as you can see, while discussing the Antarctic Treaty, I had clearly highlighted that the Antarctic Treaty provides for the definition of Antarctica. According to this particular treaty, all the land as well as ice shelves which lie to the south of 60-degree latitude is considered to be Antarctica. So the first statement which is given here is correct. The second statement is, the treaty prohibits the member countries from claiming sovereignty over Antarctica and from building military bases there. So once again, while discussing the salient features of the Antarctic Treaty, I had highlighted that Antarctica should be used only for the peaceful purposes and the member countries should not build any military bases there. Further, I had also highlighted that the countries have been given the freedom of scientific investigation for which they can set up the research stations. But just because you have set up the research stations in Antarctica, you cannot claim sovereignty over Antarctica. So the countries as such are not only prohibited from building military bases there, they are also prohibited from claiming sovereignty over Antarctica. So even the second statement which is given here is also correct. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be both 1 and 2. Now coming to the MCQ number 6, the question here is, with reference to Indian Antarctic Bill 2022, consider the following statements. The first statement is, this bill seeks to ratify India's membership to the Antarctic Treaty. See here, India has already signed and ratified the Antarctic Treaty in the year 1983. So this bill as such does not ratify India's membership to the Antarctic Treaty. Rather, this particular bill has been introduced in order to give shape to the Madrid Protocol. See, the Madrid Protocol calls upon the member countries to come up with their own legislative framework to regulate their activities in the Antarctic region. Hence, In accordance with the Madrid Protocol, India has introduced the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022, which basically seeks to regulate the Indian expedition to Antarctica, regulate the activities which are taking place in the Indian stations in Antarctica, and so on. So, if you look at the first statement which is given here, the first statement, as you can see, is clearly wrong. Look at the second statement. The second statement says that the bill regulates expeditions and setting up of the research stations in Antarctica, which is actually correct. And the third statement is the bill is applicable to only Indian citizens and not to foreign citizens. Once again, while discussing the salient features, I had clearly highlighted that the bill is not only applicable to Indian citizens, but it is also applicable to the foreign citizens as well. So the third statement which is given here is wrong. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be B, that is 2 only. The next article appears on page number 13. The article is titled as No Need to Amend the Anti-Defection Law. See, as far as this particular article is concerned, one should be aware about various aspects of anti-defection in India, that is, its provisions, interpretation of Supreme Court, problems with respect to anti-defection law, and the recommendations. All of these aspects have already covered in the DNS dated 9th of June 2021. So as you can see here, I have clearly covered as to what all reforms are needed with respect to anti-defection, wherein I have covered the recommendations of committees such as Dinesh Goswami Committee, Halim Committee, Law Commission, National Commission to Review the Working of Constitution, and so on. So those of you who would want to know the details related to anti-defection, you can go through this particular DNS. The link to this particular DNS has been provided in the description box below. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Let us have a look at the question for the day.